Hello, seventh graders. This is Mr. Shear, and I'm going to take you into one event mentioned in the next chapter of your book, which is chapter 1, lesson 3, and that's the Great Missoula Flood. And what you're looking at right now is a lake that existed 15,000 years ago in modern-day Missoula, Montana, and it was called Lake Missoula. This lake is about the size of one of our Great Lakes, Lake Huron. It is a ginormous lake, and I'll show you a visual of it in a minute, that existed 15,000 years ago during the Ice Age, and creating the lake at the head of the lake was a giant wall of ice several miles high. It would have looked kind of like a mountain range like you're looking at. In a cataclysmic event, this wall broke and all the water came rushing down to create a big part of modern-day Washington. So Montana is to the east, to the right of your screen. If you look at the Columbia Plateau, which is this brown area on this satellite photo of Washington, that whole region and the Columbia River, which makes up our southern border of Washington, were all formed in one ginormous flood, the likes of which the world had never seen and has not seen since. This is probably the biggest flood in perhaps the history of the world, but certainly the history of our region and the history of the United States. I want to point out Banks Lake. I'm going to point that out again in a little bit. Banks Lake is beautiful, by the way, if you've never been there. Banks Lake is this lake right here in central Washington. It's formed by the Grand Coulee Dam. It's long and it's huge, and to give you some perspective, many of you guys have been to Lake Chelan, which I also pointed out on this map. It is way bigger than Lake Chelan. So if you ever get a chance to go to Banks Lake, go to Banks Lake. So again, 15,000 years ago, an ice dam broke. That's an important date. I want you to know that we're talking about 15,000 years ago. And I'm going to take you through a video showing you exactly what happened. But before we do that, I want to show you some pictures of what it formed. So part of the result of this giant flood is it formed a huge portion of eastern Washington known as the Scablands, which are just outside of Spokane, Washington. You can imagine, even looking at this picture, all the water rushing through, carving out this landscape, creating the hills and the crevices and the valleys. And there's a video on this that you can watch. We're going to really get into detail on this specific event, but these are Scablands. This is how eastern Washington was created. It was certainly one big flood that kicked everything off, but by looking at the layers of rock that you can see, all the layering here, a lot of archaeologists and geologists believe that it could have been anywhere up to 100 floods. They're pretty sure there was at least 3 big floods that formed eastern Washington, but again, this is in eastern Washington, creating this dry, mountainous, hilly region. At one point, there was a waterfall that was the largest in the world. This picture is of Dry Falls, which is near Banks Lake. You can go there. This is in Washington. But as water cascaded over this dropping, it was twice as big as Niagara Falls. And at that time, they believe it was the largest waterfall in the world. And now it's called Dry Falls because there's no more water flowing over it. Also created in this cataclysmic event was the Columbia River Gorge, which is a beautiful, beautiful spot along the Columbia River. What's interesting about this is you can see how the river flows through these hills. They believe that this beautiful section of the Columbia was actually formed in a matter of a couple hours. But it is a breathtakingly beautiful spot along the Columbia River in south central Washington. And most of us will experience the Columbia River Gorge via the amphitheater. It's a music venue. So the amphitheater was built in 1986, but it was expanded in 1993 into a larger stage. That was Mr. Shear's high school years. So yeah, I saw some concerts here. It is pretty. A lot of you guys have been here. If you haven't been, I hope you get to go in your lifetime. It's a really pretty spot to see music. And as I put my little joke on there, it is one of the best music venues in the world. And I'm totally right. It really is. That's an informal opinion, but it's a really pretty spot to see music. So I'm going to take you into a video now and show you. It's about a 3-minute video that I'm going to narrate. I'm going to show you a little bit of what happened in this flood, the Great Missoula Flood. Okay, you're looking at a map of Washington. And several thousand years ago, 30,000 or so, ice began to creep down from British Columbia. And Conway would be, of course, about here. We were covered in at least a mile, some say more, 2 to 3 miles, 15,000 feet of ice here in Conway. But much of Washington was covered in a giant ice cap. Ice blocked up the Clark River Fork here. And slowly over time, ice begins to melt off and creates a huge lake in Montana, where Missoula is. This lake was huge. If you look at this lake in comparison to Washington State, this is by far a bigger lake than any lake we currently have in Washington. This is Great Lake size. Now, this lake was held in by an ice dam right here. Mountainous looking pieces of glacier. And at one point in a single day, the ice dam broke. This was about 15,000 years ago. Traveling at a rate of more than at least 60 miles per hour, the lake begins to drain rapidly and flow across Washington State. This event propelled more water across our state than all of the rivers in the world combined. A giant lake flooded our entire state. It took, geologists are guessing again because this was 15,000 years ago, but it took about 48 hours for all that water to rush across our state into the Columbia River and create the modern day state that we see. Now this area, the channels and all that, is what carved the landscape in eastern Washington, the Columbia Plateau. Whenever water would back up in a narrow spot along the Columbia already existed, but this really carved out the gorges and the cliffs that we now see. But whenever water would back up, it would go back onto the Columbia Plateau. That's what you're seeing in the red here. And it would carve the landscape into hills and crevices and valleys, making a very unique landscape in eastern Washington. Where it backs up here, in this section, right where my cursor is, that's where the gorge was created. A particularly beautiful spot along the Columbia where they have that amphitheater. The water went rushing out into the Pacific. And as I mentioned before, that is probably, scientists believe, the largest flood the world has ever seen. Now, this event took place at least 3 times. The water would build back up as the glacier melted, and every 50 years or so, they believe, it would flood again. It would do this again. They don't know how many times this happened, but they're guessing anywhere from 50 to 100 times this might have happened. They're pretty sure, science is pretty sure that it's identified at least 3 times that this has happened. So insane. Great Missoula Flood carved out all of Washington here. What you have for an assignment today is an Ed puzzle on this event, and we're going to watch a video too. One thing I like to point out is that as this flood would have happened, it's not just water carving out landscape. 15,000 years ago, there was woolly mammoths, there was bears, there was all kinds of animals, trees, debris that would have been picked up in this huge flood and swept out to the ocean. And so we're going to watch a video in our meet today that kind of takes you a little bit more into what that rushing water would have looked like. But please do watch your assignment is to watch the Ed Puzzle and answer the questions embedded within the Ed Puzzle on the Great Missoula Flood. And that's your assignment for today. All right, 7th graders, I'll see you soon.